All right, what is up, my A Push peeps? Welcome to week 3 of our A Push core curriculum, which also happens to coincide with day 1 of period 3. So we'll spend the next probably about 4 weeks here in period 3, which is going to cover our time period from 1754 to the year 1800. So it's a pretty condensed amount of time from a chronological standpoint, in that we're really only talking about 46 years. But a whole lot is going to happen in those 46 years. The colonists are going to go from happily British and happily being left alone via the policy of salutary neglect to electing America's third president by the end of this. So considering in the scope of history how much can change in 50 years, I think this unit is quite illuminating um, about the speed by which history can change when a people are motivated to, in fact, enact those changes. So, to start with, we need to figure out why all these things change. How did we get to a point in which the colonists who were quite happy being British are willing to reject their British authority, to declare independence, to die for independence potentially, and to create a new set of institutions, a new nation, really from scratch? So period 3 is really pivotal to understanding a lot of what comes next. So I urge you to refocus yourself on what you have ahead of us, to ensure you spend the proper amount of time in your text, making sure that you're prepared, and working with an open mind to learn about really the foundation and the roots of where our nation's political institutions and therefore social and economic institutions come from. Because a lot of those things are going to come right directly out of period 3. So today's lecture is titled The New Colonial Policy, uh, which implies to me, as I look at that title, that the old colonial policy of course, salutary neglect and an absenteeist mercantilism, goes by the wayside, and we have a new colonial policy. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The question I want you to have in the back and the front of your minds as we go through today's content is this prompt, which mirrors a College Board style AP prompt, which says evaluate the extent to which. Evaluate the extent to which is a big phrase. I'm going to say this to you now, and you can use it really all year. Anytime you see evaluate the extent to which, the College Board is just asking you how much. How much does this happen? So, you're going to see a lot of prompts like this. So if you just start rephrasing in your head as how much, I think it helps you get your mind around what's being asked. Evaluate the extent to which the French and Indian War caused a shift, a change in British and colonial relations. So keep that in the back of your mind, keep that in the front of your mind, and we'll grapple with this question in our live session this week. So our outline is here. I'm going to make it a point going forward to give you at least a little snapshot of what I'll be talking about, because I think it helps you orient your focus. First, we'll talk about the French and Indian War and the Albany Plan of Union. We'll talk about a real pivotal year, a turning point year of 1763. Which is one of those in our series of turning point years that you should be able to recite the significance at the drop of a hat as needed. We'll spend a couple minutes talking about the new colonial policy, which we'll refer to going forward as parliamentary sovereignty. And then at the very end, I'll give you a quick little snapshot of all of the new acts that are coming: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, this Act, that Act, the Townshend Act, the Declaratory Act, all those acts. Knowing full well that I'm going to introduce those today. They're present in your text as well, and we'll spend a little more of a deep dive on those acts in class live this week. Okay? So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get cracking. Now, what we see via the idea of salutary neglect is British absenteeism. Which of course means that, slide this up so we can see it a little better. There we go. British absenteeism, meaning the British aren't present in the colonies to exert strong and close political control. Now, this is for a variety of reasons. Reason one, there's distance between England and America. It's far away. So as colonies go, it can be hard to regulate a colony that's far away. There is political turmoil in England throughout the late 1600s via the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. That are both really important things that cause the British to look inward, right? Because they have a lot of chaos and turmoil there. And then afterwards, there's relative peace, meaning like things are cool in England, things are cool in the colonies. Like why upset a working relationship? Why change things that seem to be going just fine? Okay, so the colonies are left alone via this policy of salutary neglect, with of course the one exception that we discussed at great length last unit of mercantilism, right? Of regulatory control, not taxation, but regulatory control over how the colonists export and import goods. Okay, external regulation of what's happening economically as colonies are shipping things out or shipping things in. So the colonies are going to really be allowed to develop virtually on their own. Each region is going to develop a unique economy based on the geography and the environment and the priorities of that colony, which we spent a lot of time on last unit as well. And the colonies are going to become incredibly successful economically and therefore incredibly valuable to England economically. The economic growth in the colonies is great, especially considering how terrible things were when it started. We talked about the starving time, right, in Jamestown at the beginning when 80% of the colonists are just dying because there's no food. By the 1750s, so 150 years into colonization, the colonial gross national product, this GNP thing, that's a collection of how much they're producing, in value of raw materials and goods, is 25 million pounds a year, which accounts today to approximately $2.25 billion. So the colonies are producing a ton of value to the economic system of England. By 1750, the colonies account for 1/3 of all of Great Britain's gross national product, meaning that of all the economic equation of the British Empire, 1/3 of it is accounted for by the British North American colonies, the 13 colonies that we've been discussing all this time. So, I mean, that's a big chunk of the pie, economically speaking, in terms of what the colonies are contributing to the empire. Okay, they may not be paying taxes directly to England because they just aren't. That's the policy, but they're still contributing a ton of economic value into the British system. The GDP, which is the gross domestic product, what's being produced per capita, meaning per person, is the highest in the world by 1775, meaning the colonies are producing more value per person than anywhere else in the world, right? Not just in the English Empire, anywhere else in the world. So the colonies have created for themselves a very thriving economy, but keep in mind, they still aren't industrialized, they still aren't advanced, they're not manufacturing for the most part. Their primary role is still as raw material producer, okay? Again, this comes with a time period of self-government, as each of the colonies is going to set up their own independent governing system with a colonial assembly and potentially a royally appointed governor. But the colonists develop this idea that the government is best that is close, that is local, that is small and accessible to the people. Keep that in mind for later. By the 1750s and 60s, the colonists are proud British subjects. They look at the king with reverence. They look at Parliament with reverence. They look at England as the perfect political system in the world to model everything after. So they're incredibly proud of their British heritage and of their membership and partnership within the British Empire. And as we talked about a lot last week, because of all this progress, because of the stability that's created in the colonies, there is a high life expectancy. They're living longer than elsewhere in the world, and a very high literacy rate. So all that's going to help set the stage for what comes next, specifically the literacy rate piece. Now, as the colonies grow, there is in fact some element of conflict, which is going to be a continuity from what we talked about with Bacon's Rebellion back in 1676. Right? Bacon's Rebellion is a great example of the frontier having conflict with the established elites on the coast. So what we see here is the darker green color, which is really here in the Chesapeake coast and then here through the middle colonies in New England on the coast. Those areas are pretty much all settled and taken up by 1700. Because of the population growth that we've talked about at length, by 1750, this slightly lighter color has been settled, right, which is a little further in. And by 1775, it's even further, right? We've settled all the way up against, and even sometimes past here, like in Pennsylvania, past these Appalachian Mountains, which will play a role here in a minute. And what we see is as these colonists expand, there's a series of conflicts. There's a series of conflicts over access to land. The conflicts aren't just white settlers against Native Americans, but also white settlers against white settlers, as the colonists on the frontier are upset about the rich elites coming and taking all the good land and the like. So we see an early example of this like class conflict of the frontier that is obviously poorer and less established and less stable compared to the landed gentry or the elite class. So we're seeing this class conflict playing out because of the frontier. We're also seeing some native conflict playing out, of course, as the colonies are spreading out. They're again encroaching on native territory. And it's important to note that this happens all in the course of 75 years as the colonies become more successful. That breeds more people, uh, and that then leads to these conflicts on the frontier. So the frontier is a place of a little bit of chaos, and it's going to bring us some more chaos here in just a moment. So zooming back out, not just in on the colonies, but on world politics as a whole. Throughout much of the 16 and early 1700s, England and France are fighting. Why, you might ask, are England and France fighting? Because England and France are always fighting. They hate each other to this day. Go figure. Um, there's a series of European conflicts that have very little to do with the colonies, with the American, with what becomes the 13 colonies. Um, but they do, in fact, have longer term significance. What we'll talk about today. So, King William's War will take place in the 1680s and 90s, followed shortly by Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, followed by King George's War in the 1740s. So, all three of these are major conflicts in England and France. These wars are, of course, based on mercantilist competition, the attempts to try to gather more colonies and more places to get raw materials. And they don't really impact the colonies because they're not fought here in the colonies, but but the next one does. So these first three are important to know as like context, as background information. But the one we'll actually spend time today focusing on is the French and Indian War. And this is what the situation looks like. Because of mercantilist competition, which I just mentioned here, both the English, the British, and the French are attempting to gather themselves more land so they can have more access to raw materials and markets under this mercantile philosophy that we've spent a lot of time talking about in period two. So here in the 1750s, this dark blue is the area that the British claim and control. As you can see, it runs basically right up against those Appalachian Mountains that I showed you right here on this map. And these are the 13 colonies that have become quite well settled, right? From Georgia down to the very bottom, all the way up to New England and Massachusetts and New Hampshire right up here, right? The middle colony is there. So that's the area that the British claim and control. Now, the French claim they have access, they run everything inland of that, right? The whole Great Lakes region we talked about, much of northeastern Canada, this whole big chunk in the middle of what becomes the United States. All right, Spain's down here in Florida. Spain's been down here in Florida for a hot minute. The problem becomes this chunk of land that I will illuminate right in here, this chunk of land right in here. Because as you can see, it's two colors are shading it, which means that both the British and the French say this land belongs to us. This is our land. And this issue of disputed territory is going to cause a lot of issues in American history. This is just the first example. But what we see here is that because both powers, because both nations say it's theirs, we're going to see a military presence by both the French and the British in this area, specifically right here in the middle, which is the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River Valley, right there, as both nations say this land belongs to us. Okay? So what ends up happening is George Washington, shockingly enough, is going to kind of bumble his way into a huge world war. George Washington takes his men out to protect a land claim in the Ohio River Valley. He's a militia commander in the colonies. They fire on the French fort, Fort Duquesne there. in modern-day Pennsylvania, and all hell breaks loose. The French fort defends itself. They capture all of George Washington's men, and with that, the French and Indian War has begun over this disputed territory here in the colonies, which is why this war, more than any other of the French and British conflicts, are going to impact the colonies. So these wars that we talked about, King William's, Queen Anne's, King George, they're going to lead to a land frenzy in the 1750s as the French colonists are trying to expand and the British colonists are trying to expand. Now, it's the Ohio River Valley and the territorial dispute there that are going to spark the French and Indian War. Now, keep in mind that for the most part, the Native Americans are going to be in great favor of the French. Why? Because the French are better to the Native Americans than are the British. So it's called the French and Indian War, not because the French are fighting the Indians necessarily, but because the British are fighting the French and the Indians. Okay? So that's why it's called that. It's also referred to as the 7 Years' War, depending on which perspective you're taking. So you can use either term interchangeably. They're the same thing. The 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War is the same conflict we're talking about. So the war begins. We don't spend a whole lot of time on wars in this class. We spend a lot of time on wars in this class, but not the actual fighting of the war. We focus more on the causes and the social and political implications for war and the outcomes. But in this case, the Ohio Valley is really, really important to understand. It's a very important real estate to three key North American powers. The Iroquois, who is a very powerful Native American tribe here in the Ohio River Valley. Colonial Americans, who, as you just saw a couple maps ago, are looking to expand because land is becoming more and more scarce on the East Coast. I should say scarce, not scare. I apologize. So it's a logical place for expansion as the colonies are spreading out to the frontier. The Ohio River Valley is important. And third is the French. Right? If we go back just a little bit to this slide, we see the French have consolidated their control over the Great Lakes region here, and they have control over the New Orleans region here. So the Ohio River Valley is important to link those two regions that the French value very greatly. So all three groups are going to want control over the Ohio River Valley. The Iroquois actually are going to ally with the British, which is important and noteworthy, mostly because the British make concessions and make promises to leave them alone in the Ohio River Valley after the war. So the war goes pretty poorly at the beginning for the British and their colonial counterparts. The French have an advantage because they ally with a lot of Native American tribes, and they're just a little more prepared for the conflict. But at the beginning of the war, as things are going poorly, there's a really important meeting. 1754, beginning of the war. That's why the period 3 begins in 1754 because of this. 7 of the 13 colonies, so 7 of the colonies are going to meet for the first time, right, as a unit, as a group, for what they call an Intercolonial Congress, a meeting amongst the colonies. Now they're going to call this they're going to call this the Albany Congress. Why are they going to call that? Because they meet in Albany, New York. Now, the goal of this meeting is to keep the Iroquois tribe loyal to the British. The goal is simply to ensure that their biggest Native American ally stays allied with the British forces. But some really unique ideas are going to come out of this Congress that are going to be championed or pushed by Benjamin Franklin, a guy who we talked about last unit as well, as one of the leaders of the American Enlightenment philosophy. Ben Franklin poses this question that says, what if we as colonies all came together and we all put money into a pot, so to speak, right? We all paid taxes all to one unit, and then that would pay, the money of those taxes would pay for colonial defense so that we can have enough money to pay to conduct this war effort in a more organized, structured way as one unit, as opposed to a bunch of separate, independent by themselves colonies. Okay, decent idea, right? Wars are fought better when things are organized. The colonies say, nope, absolutely not, no way, that's a non-starter, we're not doing it, because that sounds scary, like a faraway government taking our money and doing we don't know what with it, All right, this sounds like a faraway government taxing us. We don't like that. Individual colonies, colonies like Virginia, colonies like North Carolina, colonies like Massachusetts, are instead concerned about losing their sovereignty, their power, their independence, their authority. And they don't want to concede like the idea of somebody else being able to tax them to some bigger group. So the Albany Plan of Union fails. But it's still really important because it's a first attempt, it's a first step to try to achieve intercolonial unity, unity amongst all the colonies. We talked last week, right, about one of the important things of the Great Awakening is that it started establishing ties amongst the colonies. The Albany Plan is a logical next step to a more interconnected colonial group. And even though it fails, it is a unique first step towards trying to figure out how to create intercolonial unity. Franklin publishes this really famous, awesome piece of like early political cartoon. Obviously, the message is quite clear. We need to join together, or we'll be like a snake, dead, cut into pieces. We see New England here at the head, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So the snake goes, of course, north to south, and his argument is, unless we come together, then we will die. Join or die. Thanks, Ben Franklin. So the war goes on. The British eventually win. They exert their naval supremacy. The war ends in the Treaty of Paris, the first of a whole bunch of treaties of Paris that we'll cover this year, of 1763. 1763. So I told you at the beginning of this discussion that 1763 would play a large role as a turning point year. This is the first thing that happens in 1763 that matters. And the treaty gives the British all of French Canada, so all that land you saw that the French said they had, and Spanish Florida, so that little sliver of Spanish control down south. France is going to give Spain all their inland land, all the land west of the Mississippi River. I'll show you a map in a minute, but all the land west of the Mississippi River. And now France is gone, right? Britain now controls half of North America. Spain controls the other half of North America. France has nothing. It sucks to be France, right? Losing wars has consequences. It looks like this. Good map. So before the war, of course, things are a little bit jumbled. We got the British area. Here. We have all the French control and then that disputed territory I told you about. After the war, look at that. Nice and clean. There's a Mississippi River, cuts right through the middle of the continent. Everything east, British. Everything west, Spanish. Okay? So it's helpful to look at this map as you figure out like what are the outcomes of the war. So now the colonists are looking at this like, man, look at all this land we can spread out to now. This is great. Check us out. Right? We're part of the British Empire. We're living it up. Life is good. We got Florida. We got all this stuff. Man, this is good stuff. Now, looking at the war on the back end from a perception standpoint, the colonies think of themselves very highly. They're like, look at us. We did our part. We fought in this conflict on behalf of the British government. We can be strong. We can work together. We have all this new territory on the frontier. We can get some new wealth. We can spread out new land. We've learned how to fight a war. We are awesome. The English, however, are going to say like, no. Like, we had to rescue you. You guys started this war. You were slow to organize. You refused the idea of coming together to pay taxes and paying money to protect even your own lands. Like, you guys were worthless. So these two opposing views on the consequences of the war are going to have important ramifications for later. Additionally, at the very tail end of the war, King George III becomes king. And he's going to play a big role in what comes next. King George III becomes king, and he begins a new strategy, a new colonial policy. No more salutary neglect. No more leaving them alone. We're going to assert what's called parliamentary sovereignty. Now, sovereignty means ultimate power. So breaking this phrase down, breaking this title down, he's going to assert the idea that Parliament, the government, the legislative body in England, is going to have the final say on whatever happens in the colonies. English officials are going to assume that Parliament has the ultimate authority over everything, all laws and taxes. The colonists are going to disagree. They're going to say no. Our local legislators, our local little colonial assemblies, that's where our local power resides, not in Parliament. And because of all these wars that now England and France have fought, England is broke. England is dead broke, and they're going to begin looking to the colonies as a source of tax revenue, not just revenue from raw materials. So this idea, this shift in colonial policy is key because it's fed by a couple things. It's fed by, of course, England's brokenness. It's fed by King George's concern that the colonies are getting too powerful and too spread out and too unruly and hard to control. And it's going to come directly from the French and Indian War, in which the British look at the colonies and don't think that they are um, smart to be left alone to do their own thing, because if they do, they might start a war with the French, which they did. So 1763 becomes our big turning point year. Of course, first is the Treaty of Paris, which we already talked about, and I added some other turning point years just to remind you. 1607, Jamestown. 1619, House of Burgesses and Slaves in Virginia. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion. 1763 is our next big one that you should have tattooed on your forearm, just to make sure you remember all these things. So the colonists are going to pour in great numbers into the newly won territory because they feel they've contributed to the war effort and thus they should reap the rewards of the war. They pour into the new territory, which of course is going to make the natives furious because the natives lost their best ally, their best friend who was kind to them, didn't send a bunch of people, the French. The natives liked the French being there because they didn't settle, they didn't stay, they didn't bring a bunch of people, they had positive relations. Whereas now it's not the French are gone, and it's British settlers that are pouring into this territory. Natives are upset, and they stage what becomes known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion. This is named for a Native American chief named Pontiac. He's going to coordinate a whole uprising, a whole rebellion, at the same time attacking new settlements and forts throughout this Ohio River Valley that was just gained in a very coordinated attack. Several thousand settlers are killed. Many English forts are burned to the ground. So the Native Americans have created a coordinated uprising to push back on this expansion. Pontiac's Rebellion, also 1763, big thing. The British response is to attack these villages, to kill all sorts of natives, and of course to intentionally spread smallpox, because that seems like a reasonable response to Native Americans being mad that you're taking their land, is to spread an epidemic disease to them, to those that you can't kill with warfare. So Pontiac's Rebellion is going to be an important turning point. That's what it looks like here. We see this is the whole Ohio River Valley. All these little fire symbols are British forts that are taken over by Native Americans. These other forts like Detroit and Fort Niagara, and here these other three that are in closer to Pennsylvania and Maryland are going to be attacked by the natives. Other forts are going to be abandoned by the British, like this one up here, Fort Edward Augustus. So it doesn't go well for the colonists or the English. They have this new territory, they're spreading out to it, and the natives are like, no, you're not. What we do see, though, as a result of Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, is a huge rash of frontier justice attempted to be done against the Native Americans. Retaliatory attacks by colonists that are on the frontier that are having to deal with Native Americans are going to just attack all sorts of Native Americans in retaliation for what they see as the loss of their ability to spread out. This is a good example of the Paxton Boys. It's worth noting it's good. SFI College Board loves the Paxton Boys, so you should too. Not loves like that, but loves to include them in things. So the Paxton Boys are a great example of like frontier justice, right? Of groups of individuals on the frontier taking the law into their own hands and savagely beating and killing Native Americans because as revenge for Pontiac's Rebellion. So Pontiac's Rebellion tells the British government two things. Thing one, the colonies are going to keep spreading out and causing trouble. Thing two, we can't afford to keep paying for the problems that they're creating. So because of the huge debt the British have incurred, the British don't want to keep paying for conflicts, right? They've gotten what they wanted. They got rid of the French in North America. Like they're not really trying to pay for any more of these conflicts. So because of that, they're going to pass a new law, which is going to tell the colonies, you cannot spread out past the Appalachian Mountains. That mountain range that was confining you in before, you can't pass that. All right, you can do whatever you want here on the Atlantic seaboard, but you are not spreading out westward past these mountains. It's called the Proclamation Act or the Proclamation Line of 1763. And it's going to prohibit any colonial settlement west of the Appalachians. Now, this makes the colonies furious because they say, we fought that war too, and now we can't go enjoy the fruits of our labor. We're part of the British Empire. That's British territory. Thus, we're going to go hang out there. We're going to go settle there. We're going to go take that land. So the colonies just completely ignore the proclamation. They say, cool, you can't spread out past this line? Well, we're going to do it anyway, and what are you going to do about it? Because you're way the hell over in England, and you can't stop us. The colonists view the line as an obstruction or an impediment to their legitimate economic progress and economic growth, so they just keep spreading out anyway, which of course is going to cause more frontier conflict, like I showed you in that map at the very beginning. Now, the Proclamation Line of 1763 is the last important thing in 1763. So, with the Treaty of Paris, we have Pontiac's Rebellion, and we have the response to that, which is this Proclamation Line. So those three things all happen in the same year, which is why it's considered a huge turning point, especially in British and colonial relations amongst the two groups. So let's look at this from a input-output situation. First problem, the Indians continue to attack the colonies. Why do they attack the colonies? Because the colonies are spreading out. That's problem one. Problem two, the king is worried, the king is concerned that as the colonies keep moving inland, they're getting farther and farther and farther from British control and farther from Britain. And England's real power is in their navy, which controls the ocean. So the farther the colonies get from the ocean, the less control they'll have. So the king's worried that the colonies, if they keep spreading out, they're going to have too much power and they're going to be more powerful than their mother country. So Parliament passes the Proclamation Line of 1763. Right? He's trying to solve all the problems at once. Problem one solved. Right? If the colonies stop spreading out, the Indians agree to stop attacking the colonies. Win-win. And second win, the colonists will remain closer to the coast where the king can use the Royal Navy to keep them under control. What happens instead is this makes the colonies very, very angry at King George because they feel like they've lost their rights to expand and do whatever they want. The king thinks, funny enough, King George is an interesting man. The king thinks that the colonists are going to be happy about the proclamation, that they're going to be thrilled that England's protecting them from the natives, when in reality they're instead furious that England has restricted their ability to expand. So this is what the line looks like. There it is. There's the Proclamation Line. It just follows the Appalachian Mountains there. And the rule is colonies can do whatever they want here. They just can't spread out. And of course, it is largely ignored. So the outcomes of the war and the consequences, like Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation Line, are varied. Outcome one, the British Empire becomes really the world's first superpower in terms of its reach, its breadth, its economic influence. But despite all the territory they've gained, they're actually in a shakier place than before the war because they are kind of empire is expensive. You need to send soldiers all over the world to keep things under control and stable. So England has this huge empire and is going to really struggle to pay for it, which is going to lead to an era of taxation, which we'll talk about later this week. But the colonists are going to feel really proud of their British identity after the war. They're going to feel like they're entitled to the same rights as everybody else in England. Why? Because of these Enlightenment ideals of representation and natural rights, and the government's here to protect us and make sure that we are secure in our life, our liberty, our property. And it's this fact that, and back to like Anglicization, it's this thing, this issue that the colonists are so proud to be British, which is going to be the seeds of the revolution because they think they're being wronged in their rights as British citizens. These seeds of discontent are beginning to be planted as the colonies begin to get more upset over Parliament attempting to exert control over the colonies from afar. I've told you this since like the second day of class, that the colonies like their political power to be small, local, and close to home. But in 1763, nobody sees a revolutionary war on the horizon. Nobody does. I want to emphasize this. Despite the mounting tension over this idea of parliamentary sovereignty, is mounting tension between the government and the American colonists. Most Americans still see themselves as loyal like brothers to England, right? They see themselves as like equals to England, proud members of the British Empire, whereas the British look at it as here's England, here's the colonies. The colonies are saying colonies, England, we're the same. And this loyalty, this connection still comes from that shared British culture that we talked about last week, a dependence on British consumer goods that we've talked about the last 2 weeks, and this feeling of nationalism and pride after these military victories against the French. So what comes next is going to change all that, and we'll save that for our live session this week. But this is just a quick look at how England is going to work to pay for their empire. First, with the Sugar Act, charging a tax on all things that use sugar, followed by a Stamp Act, and then a Declaratory Act, and the colonies are mad, and they're rebelling, and they're protesting, and then the Townshend Acts, and then the Tea Act, and then the Boston Tea Party, and then the Intolerable Acts are passed, and next thing you know, by 1775, the colonies are declared to be an open rebellion. So we see in the span of the next 11 years, things go a little haywire, but we'll save that for our live session. Have a great day. And I look forward to seeing you live in class on Tuesday and Thursday. Love y'all.